All right, you wicked people. Been a while since we've done one of these, but let's do before we do the Jesus one. 'Cause that's a larger one. I'm lazy for it today, but um, let's talk about trauma and manipulation. Let's talk about psychology a little bit. I know a lot of people are interested in psychology, and if they're not, they should be interested in psychology because in truth, when it comes to a practical level, there is no spirituality without at least the basic foundational knowledge of psychology. I know a lot of people claim they know psychology or they're interested in psychology and da 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 da, but psychology is an incredibly undermined discipline, especially in modern times, and it's also a very undervalued and underrated and underestimated discipline in the sense of its depth and its depth, both medical and spiritual depth, are incredibly immense. Um, a lot of people think they can just like read a book from I don't know like Young or any of the other sort of like I don't even know like if I want to call it psychology, right? Like so they'll read like Freud or something like that, and they'll be like, "Well, I share in their ideals and so on and so forth." But the truth of the matter is that on a theoretical level, on a theoretical basis, everything is very simple. Just pack a bunch of people in a room, and you can tell them, well, you have to hold yourself accountable. Well, thanks a lot, sheriff. How exactly do I do that? Right? And that's when the bullshitting begins usually because these people actually don't know how to do it. They don't know how to achieve it. They perhaps, from a niche understanding, understand how to achieve it for themselves and on their own, but they don't know how to help you achieve it, right? To sort of like generalize the knowledge. That's why psychology, psychotherapy, any sort of therapy, right, is first and foremost a practice-based discipline, right? You can have all the knowledge in the world. You can know a lot of different theories here and there, how the mind works or how it's supposed to work, so on and so forth. But the mind is an incredibly understudied and lied about concept, right? So this is why practice is the most important thing. You're not going to get hired off of your um, knowledge. You're going to get hired off of your practice. Well, what have you done? Who have you sort of like assisted or supported or along those lines? And I can tell you with firsthand experience that nothing can truly prepare you for the on-field portion of, let's say, work that dabbles in psychology or is based around psychology or knowledge of psychological sort of like trauma, psychosis, any kind of like therapy, behavioral therapy. Because the realities of the thing are far more complex and far more heavy than anything you'd ever encounter on paper, right? Because the conditions aren't sterile. There's a lot of incredibly, I don't know, like mystified variables that are in play that you don't really know how to deal with unless you have a sort of like a creative mind, unless you can well first identify them and then go through and work them out and then sort of like synergize and mock up a sort of a environment for the subject, whoever you're treating, your beneficiary, to then allow themselves to engage what you would call self therapy or healing or whatever, right? So trauma is an incredible um sort of like taboo shunned part of um today's society and humanity at all, completely. Trauma is something that most people don't know how to identify, and it's also something most people don't know how to go through because it's incredibly individualistic in how it expresses itself and when it expresses itself. And trauma is basically that thing that keeps the average person from the level of attainment, something with something who would have like a healthy upbringing would have, right? So it's very easy for, let's say, someone who hasn't experienced trauma or significant traumatic events, throughout their life, to go out and basically teach you, right? Like, well, this is what you have to do. Just do it. Just feel like this. Just will through it. Just da 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 da. These people, largely don't know what they're talking about, right? Because they haven't really experienced the full brunt of a traumatic event, upon themselves. Largely, um, symptomatically how trauma is expressed in our lives is largely unseen. That's one thing. And secondly, and I guess the more important thing about trauma is that it isn't always expressed, right? So you can be very functional in one portion of your life, right? And you could be incredibly dysfunctional in another portion. Um, and trauma and manipulation go hand to hand, right? Or hand in hand, however that term is used usually. Trauma is the gateway to manipulative vulnerability, right? So if you want to exploit someone or expose someone to sort of like volatile ideologies and suggestion, like make them open to suggestion, what's the first thing you do? Well, first you torment them, right? Because you traumatize them. What trauma creates, it creates a sort of fragmented mind state. It's called a dissociative mind state. So if you can almost get a person to dissociate from their current reality, what happens? They need a new reality, right? And you're there to fill in the blanks, right? Now, an interesting thing about the human mind is that it's a pattern recognition device, right? That's what the human brain does. It locks down patterns, it recognizes them, and it tries to make sense of it, right? Um, And then on the other hand, another thing it does is it does whatever it can to um, preserve itself, to preserve the sanity of the wielder, so to speak, right? Um, and sometimes the preservation of that sanity means fragmenting different types of memories or experiences, or even lying to yourself about the nature of your current existence, right? So sometimes you might become disillusioned with reality. You could tell yourself a different narrative or a story compared to what actually happened. Obviously, why this is done. This is done to maintain the ego mind, right? To at some level allow yourself to retain honor and dignity, right? Life is tough. Sometimes you go through things that shatters your identity, and the moment that identity is shattered, this self-defense mechanism that your mind has, it activates, right? And what it wants to give you is like, okay, like maybe there's some sort of slow dissolution of our past identity and who we were, but it can't be something that just completely shatters our world, right? And shatters our self-view, because we risk being traumatized and we risk fragmenting our conscious state because of it. Most people today that you will talk to, especially on the internet, they're very traumatized. Meaning, when we say traumatized, we mean that their minds are largely fragmented. And then it's a strange time we live in, because there's two castes of people, right? There's one cast of people who are incredibly traumatized from the horrendously difficult lives that they've had to go through and live through. Yet we expect them to become healthy members of society. And then there's another cast who have not gone through any sort of significant trauma, but who are convinced that they've gone through significant trauma, right? And usually it's sort of like the upper class that tells the lower class, oh bro, like you just have to be like, just will yourself to do it, will yourself to be healthy, will yourself to be this way or that way, right? And the person who's sort of like in this traumatic loop, right? They it's not that the effect is achieved, right? So like the upper class people we talk about, like I guess what they're trying to achieve is this effect of like, if you just really will yourself through it, you can get out of your victim mentality. But the problem is you're just increasing the trauma of these persons, because if they could get out of it just like that, why would they stick around in their traumatized state, right? This is really important to understand. A lot of people exacerbate trauma by being overly ignorant of its effects. They don't really understand what trauma is. Like imagine, like if you hadn't gone through any significant trauma, right? And you look at someone who's traumatized, and you look at them, and they're all kinds of awkward and they're weird and they're pathetic in a sense, right? Because they're unable to have basic daily function. They're unable to achieve these basic things that like to you they come really easily, right? Well, why can't you just like do this? God damn it, it's not really that difficult. And like this point of irritation begins. So a lot of people manipulate traumatized people without really realizing as well. That's a very big tragedy too, especially those who are like very egotistic and who usually an interesting research and an interesting statistic about trauma is that people who consider themselves traumatized by their adventures actually, most of the times end up not being traumatized at all. They just want the tag of it, right? They just want to be tagged as someone who's been traumatized. Oh, I got through like so much stuff. I was born in the ghetto. This is where you hear this stuff, right, all the time because they want to create this image of like them having overcome great trauma to get to where they are right now. And being functional within today's society, and they want to create like this sort of like fake depth of like, hey, like I actually had it hard too. I had this like, difficult time, and look where I am now. You can do this, blah blah blah. Largely listening to these people is just wrong. It's just useless. If you swapped places, right? Like, let's say we have someone who's, I don't know, like born in a rich family in California somewhere, like what they perceive as trauma and what a child in Gaza today would perceive as trauma is just completely friggin' different, right? Completely friggin' different. And for that person, right, like when the child like just starts to shake whenever they hear, like a something buzzing in the room, like for them it's just like an incredible, they can't even like emphasize with it, right? Like, they don't understand the root of the thing. So it's very difficult, like for me even personally, like to talk to people like seriously when they say like, "Oh, I had like such a traumatic life and I was so traumatized." No, you weren't. Most likely you weren't, right? You don't know what trauma is, right? Like people who were traumatized don't just talk about their trauma like that. Like that's like the first giveaway, right? Like oh, you were like super traumatized by something, but here you are, like you're just chilling and talk like, get it? Like that goes against the definition of what trauma is. Trauma doesn't really go away. It turns into like this sort of like subconscious involuntary program that you carry with you, and it doesn't go away, right? Like, I know a person, for example, who used to be terrified of receiving phone calls because they would receive phone calls from a relative or a parent, I don't remember, right, who threatened to kill themselves every other night during their teenage years, right? It scarred them for life. Incredible trauma. So every time the phone rings, they get all like antsy, right, and anxious now. Like it's an involuntary um, effect, right? It's an involuntary program, even though they can rationalize that, that everything's fine now, like nothing terrible is going to happen. It's still that program persists. That is the definition of trauma, right? It is something that one can rationalize and be openly aware of. You can speak about it, but the effects of it um, persist, right? Now, when we realize that, we also realize that people live on sort of like uneven ground when it comes to that, right? We live in a strange society where trauma is largely manufactured by social media, mass media, Hollywood, cinema, everyday living, war, conflict, economic hardship, so on and so forth. Um, the first thing you don't want to tell a person who's traumatized is that they're not doing enough, right? And I know this sounds cliche, and I know like some idiot, red pill whatever is gonna come out and say, well, oh, just don't be a wuss, bro, just go and get it done. Man, like at some point that sort of discourse because becomes very unserious, right? These are the types of people who traumatize their own children with the same stuff, right? They think they're doing something that's like badass or cool or whatever, but the truth is, them behaving that way is a part of their trauma, right? Is a part of their unaddressed, like, inner emotional turmoil. And how that trauma expresses itself is through just, infecting everyone else around them with it. So, okay, like why did we make this intro about like what trauma is, right? Like I want people to understand how people become manipulated, right? And who is most open to becoming to being manipulated, and like where these people even come from. Um, because like if you're in the field of sort of like religious dogma and spirituality and esotericism, so on and so forth, you know that the primary sort of like attribute of this whole space is there's a lot of people who are incredibly they're armed with this strange zealotry about like this ideology or this person or whatever. um um they're very emotionally invested and emotionally attached to convincing you of whatever like they believe in, or who you should like or who you should dislike, that type of thing. All of these people largely are manipulated into these positions, right? Because no healthy human being um shares that sort of like crazy fanatical fervor when it comes to um, like obsessing over or worshiping another human being, right? No man is a follower, right? That you can be a student of some sort of teaching, you can be a student of a person, right? But to be a follower in the sense of that this is my identity now, right? I always say that I feel very, very sorry and very sad for these people, right? Because I know how they got there, and how they got there is not pretty. So how they got there was they were in a vulnerable state, right? And usually it's three directions you can take the set. So they were either financially struggling, right? Financial struggles is a big taboo theme, especially in the West. A lot of shame and guilt associated with it. Secondly, they were probably orphans or orphaned, so no functional family. They probably come from dysfunctional families. They probably have either no existing relationship with parent figures or parents, or they have toxic or dysfunctional relationship with their parents. Okay, this is number two. And number three is sexual deviance, right? So these are the three sort of like windows that open up um, in young men and women who are open to being exploited and manipulated by these sort of like culty, manipulative types. Even if you look at the history of cults and, several case studies, you can even watch a documentary on YouTube, even though they're very surface level when it comes to psychoanalysis, you'll get the general gist of it, right? That it's never the person who comes from a strong and loving and supporting family unit that is usually sort of like funneled into this um, culty manipulation, trauma bonding cycle, right? It's always someone who's from some sort of dysfunctional environment. So, what causes people to create these unhealthy emotional bonds is their existing trauma and someone wicked enough to identify this trauma, and then someone who's lacking the moral compass, so to speak, to go full out and take full advantage of the trauma. So it's very important even for us to understand what sort of like trauma we're working with, and to work through this trauma at our own pace, right? I'm not saying that we're gonna, get manipulated or exploited by, some people, God forbid. But it is important to understand what trauma is and how it functions. Again, because being aware of your trauma and being able to rationalize your trauma, it doesn't mean that you're not vulnerable to having it exploited, right? Same example I gave you with the person that's afraid of receiving voice calls. They're not afraid of it anymore, but they get a bad feeling every time, right? So they get this like, weird anxious feeling about it, right? That's how it seeps into your psyche. Now, when we talk about manipulation, manipulation and trauma, um, at least on the highest level, right? How social media does it, and how these what I would call basically black magicians. What how they do it is they understand psychology very well, very intimately, and they understand that there's two kinds of psychology, right? So there is the formative identity of a person, and then there's the e- sort of post-formative identity. Let's call it that. So the formative identity is what you would see in a child. It's what you would see in a developing sort of like consciousness when the consciousness is in a state of self exploration. So it doesn't even know what it is yet, right? It hasn't established a sort of like form for itself, like a baseline. Like, okay, like this is who we are, and we are going to go and interact with the world from this lens of, well, who am I, right? Um, in that state, okay, not the formative one, not the post formative one, but the transitional state that happens between these two states, right? When the identity is in the process of being formed, that's when it's most open to corruption. Okay. Again, these people know psychology on a very deep level, not on like this basic amateur level that's like, what does this dream mean or whatever. No, no, no. Like they understand sort of like the nitty-gritty of it all. So when I'll tell you what happens when you become aware of human psychology and deterministic behavior on this level, right? Is very interesting. um, what kind of results you can get from it. So when you're working at this level, which is like the formative years, and this is like you can imagine, like it's different for every person. Okay, so there's no like baseline, but it's different for every person. But let's say somewhere between the ages of from you know 12 to 24, somewhere along those lines, it's 12, 24. This is where most of this manipulating happens. And how it happens, firstly, is through shared trauma, collective trauma. So this is the trauma you're presented through, movies, cartoons, social media, different, archetypal stories that are like corrupted and shoved in your mouth, right? For example, if you take any Disney story, right, what is the starting, like beginning foundation of the Disney story? The main character is almost always an orphan. They're somehow very violently and brutally, by unknown means, through unknown means, they're snatched away from their parent figures and they're thrown into this world of the unknown. And this world of the unknown is so dissociative because um, they can't make sense of the world. A child can't make sense of the world, that it almost becomes like an Alice in Wonderland thing where you're experiencing the mundane and the trivial and whatever is normal, but you're not experiencing it in a normal way. You're experiencing it in sort of like this mythical sense where everything is larger than life, right? So this feeling, this almost like in a ritualistic sense, this idea of large buildings looming over you, right? And you being sort of like terrified and shaped by the world around you is exactly the effect these sort of like, movies and cartoons and so on and so forth, they want to achieve, right? Like they want to plant the idea within you that, you might step, yeah, through a portal or a hole, and you're going to be in this new and incredible world that you don't understand. And the very first character that you meet, right, um, is usually some sort of friendly, non-human spirit or sentient being or animal or so on and so forth, right? So it's never like interfacing with another human being. It's almost like meeting a um, yeah, like some sort of like strange third party, which is usually spawned from the imagination of the person going through the trauma. So it's like an imaginary friend. And when you're going through trauma and when you're going through this stage of dissociation where you can't make sense of the life around you, the first thing the mind does, it creates an externalized, like an external figure that you can project competence onto, right? So, let's say if I'm heavily traumatized, what my mind will try to do is it will try to go beyond my identity and create some sort of new fantastical identity that I can refer to and have a conversation with, and that identity can pretend to be the competent one, right? um, that identity can be the brave firefighter or someone along those lines, right? It would always come in an image where you see, sort of like that imaginary figure is someone who's very brave and very bold and competent, and usually they're capable of doing the things that you're not capable of doing, right? So let's say we take childhood trauma. This is the first effect of that childhood trauma. Now, the people who know this, right, on a very deep level, right, they understand that creating these subtle, emotional connections with these types of characters, is what gets the youth out of the house the most, so to speak, right? There are some things that are too complicated, like, like when some websites, like dating sites, ask you to like pick your relationship status, and one of the status is like it's complicated. It's just giving you that option to say like, oh, it's complicated, like, no one understands me, I can't talk to my parents about this. So now they've created this window in your psyche, and when this window is created, it dissociates. It allows you, not just children. I don't want to say just the child, because there are adults who have this happen to them all the time without them being aware. It allows you to dissociate from what you would call your day to day, like average living, and then fall into this make believe world, where you are enthralled by how fantastical it is, right? Um, and this is done through different characters, through different archetypal characters, right? Like the wise old man, or the caring old grandma, da da da, right? Like all of these archetypal characters, they were formed a very very long time ago, and they were formed within the collective imagination of the human, psyche, of the collective psyche, right? These are sort of like the archetypal figures that we ourselves make up, to project things onto them, right? The wise old man always has the answers, right? The old witch in the woods can heal your wounds, like that type of thing. So where does sort of like the archetypal imagery of the wise old man come from? It comes from there. It comes from, a deep innate trauma that exists within us, right? Now the question here is, does the wise old man always have the right answers? Of course not, because the wise old man is just a projection of your own sort of like inner turmoil, trying to feign competence, right? When it doesn't have any. So, if you follow the wise old man, you're basically, what you're doing is just you're following like your utmost basic idea of what the correct behavior is. But most of the time, and sometimes, let's say, but most of the time, you're not equipped with the necessary sort of like knowledge or experience or whatever to really come up with a solution for your trauma. That's why the trauma exists and why it persists. So, let's say these young men and women who are going through this sort of trauma, what when they stop dissociating, right? When they stop dissociating from, um, the troubles, or their everyday troubles, what they begin to do is they start to look for these archetypes in actual people, in like other people. They'll start to look for these archetypes, and usually they won't find it in their family, their support circle, their immediate sort of like relatives, friends. When they're unable to find this archetype there, right? Um, um, they will always reach out further and further and further. So this is why we say, like, the further a person goes from their, sort of like family, the more they detach from their family, the the easier it is to manipulate them. And what do manipulators and serial killers and obsessive boyfriends and girlfriends, what do they do with sort of like their victims? Most of the times, their first and most important agenda is to isolate a person from their family, right? They don't want them getting good advice. They don't want them getting, sort of like, they don't want them grounded in reality again and in love and compassion and empathy and so on and so forth. So how most of these cults and culty societies and so on and so forth spawn is, they prey on the people who they know they're sort of like far from home. This is like the idea of like the archetypal idea of being far from home being a bad thing too. Right? Like, why is it a bad thing to be far from home? Well, that's why it's a bad idea to be far from home because you're very exposed, you're very vulnerable to all of these manipulative characters, and the manipulative character then comes out and they embody, and they know how to do this so unconsciously. They embody one of the archetypes. So they'll embody the archetype of, oh, I'm older than you, I'm wiser than you, and I know what's going on. And if you just follow my rules, if you do this and this and this, I'll take care of you as long as this and this and this, blah, blah, blah. Right. So it's like a transactional deal hidden behind a fake sort of like care and empathy and so on and so forth. They'll become like this father figure, or it'll be sort of like a they'll find a manipulative woman who will play as the sort of like the caring figure in their life, right? Who has true, genuine love and empathy for them, but in truth, they don't. But the traumatized person will always project these things onto them. So even if she does like something terrible to you, let's say you're traumatized, uh, your sort of like mind will almost always default to like, okay, like this is probably like somehow either my fault, right? I deserved to be treated this way, or she's doing this for my interest somehow. And I know this sounds ridiculous to someone who hasn't experienced this sort of trauma, but I'm sure you've experienced other kinds of trauma where you have found yourself to feel very dysfunctional, right? You were made to feel like, man, how could I be so silly? Like, how could this have happened to me, right? I'm generally a smart person, but again, this is how trauma works and how it manifests itself, right? Now, um, traumatic people um, lash out in different ways. So, traumatic people attract other traumatized people, meaning that the person who's doing the manipulation, who's doing the manipulative behavior, they're also incredibly traumatized. And the person who's being preyed upon, they're also traumatized. So this is the principle where, like, the hunter and the hunted, are on the same wavelength. Absolutely, they bleed into the same river, so to speak, right? Um, and understanding is very important because only the person who is traumatized can interface with the experience of the person who's also traumatized. The difference between these two is that one of them finds themselves in a position of influence and power over the other. And they know exactly what they're going through, and they know their weaknesses because they have the same weaknesses, or they had the same weaknesses when they were preyed upon, right? So how you gather, it's like there's always like this weird age gap thing in these sort of like culty societies as well, right? Where the manipulator and the manipulated, right, um create this synthetic age gap between two of the people. So it's always like one is like the dynamic, all-knowing teacher type, and the other is wholly incompetent and submits to their worldviews. Right? Even if there is no actual age gap, that sort of thing starts to form uh, as a sort of like this symbolic way of expressing that one party is far more mature and far more, competent than the other. And this is what you see in most of these cases where you have this blind loyalty from these brainwashed younger types that who think they've found a sort of either like father figure or mom figure or something like that in this person, right? And they would do anything for them. They would do anything to prove their worth to them, right? They would do anything to appease them and to appeal to their good side and so on and so forth. In truth, they're very very deeply traumatized. And the person pulling the strings, they usually know what they're doing on a conscious level at this point, right? Because they've found comfort in their trauma. Like to them, like their worldview is like, if I'm not the puppet master, then I'm the puppet. They they have a dysfunctional, disillusioned view of reality. So this whole space is like, I'm doing this whole space is because someone asked me like why like why I say that, like, okay, we can't save everyone, and like some people are impossible to save, right? Why do people who seem to be functional and seem to be sort of like smart in some fields of life, some areas of life, they'll go and they'll become a member of the cult of Scientology, right? Which is like the most ridiculous thing you'll ever hear, right? Or other cults or smaller memberships or whatever, like these groups, and that's why. So, no, you can't save everyone because they're so attached to this system now, this dynamic, that they believe it's almost impossible for them to get out because they don't want to get out. Mm, this is why I've also always been against forming these sorts of like groups where the dynamic is like, even in martial arts, I really hated when in gyms you would go and there's always this dynamic of like, there's this like some person who glorifies their status as like, oh, well, like I am uh, the master of this dojo type of thing. It's so dull, right? It creates this toxic dynamic between people where this hierarchy has to be followed not through respect, right, or and not naturally, but it just has to be followed because that's sort of like the default state of things, right? That's like the status quo. um so when we talk about trauma, and we talk about all kinds of trauma that we've been subjected to as well, right? Like, what is your idea of an adventure? Like, really think about that for a second. If you ask most people, their idea of an adventure is something far removed from their family. It's almost like your family is blocking your ability to be your true self and to go on a full adventure, right? That's sort of like the modern idea of an adventure, where you can sort of like go out into the world and let yourself loose and let your wings fly, and do what you want to do, and your family is sort of like this element that keeps you from achieving that, right? So it's always removed from the family unit. um, what's your idea of fun, right? It's removing yourself from, I don't know, your ordinary living, right? And going and doing something that's probably kind of stupid and dangerous, right? That's probably a little bit volatile. It's probably something you shouldn't be doing, right? You shouldn't be speeding in your car at 2 a.m., right? So, with a girl sitting next to you, type of thing. Like, um, it's always like the adventure is sold to you as something that's incredibly fantastical, like something that you can't even imagine, right? Like in the movie Eyes Wide Shut, there's this great scene where Tom Cruise is flirting with these two women at a party, right? And he gets interrupted, by this doctor who has trouble, wherever, wherever, and then he sort of like departs from them, and he's going to help the doctor with a little problem he has later on in his little personal room. But before he goes up there, like he asks these two girls, these two women, right? Like, hey, where are you guys taking me? Where exactly are we going, right? And they tell him like, um, we're going to where the rainbow ends, right? So what is where the rainbow ends? It's an unimaginable thing, right? Because the rainbow doesn't end. Um, so this idea of an abstract, um, fantastical place that you're headed to, through the use of drugs or dissociative drugs or just dissociation or some sort of disillusionment with life, right? It becomes very, very, very intense, and it becomes you get a taste for it, right? Um, and this is where most of the traumatic cycles repeat. So it's very like you can imagine like a person who's going through this sort of like strange disillusionment with life, through like depression or trauma or childhood trauma. You imagine like how someone sounds to them when they say like, "Oh, like just do it, bro," or "Oh, just don't be a wuss, don't be a coward, do it this way, don't do it that way. Go and hustle and bustle and grind and get that money, king," or whatever these like stupid solutions people have nowadays. Um, um, the For them to even care about these concepts is so distant to them. Like that's what we should understand about people who have gone through actual trauma. Like for them, these things don't matter. Like the the idea of you like hustling and grinding to get money and to get like a house with a pool, it literally doesn't matter because they're already experiencing such a fantastical adrenaline filled intense reality that nothing can really actually compare to that, right? Even if they're in a horrendous situation in life, right? Even if they're literally like being tormented and suffering every single day, um their ability to relate to your stupid like everyday like hustle vibes or whatever is ridiculous, right, to them, and should be for you as well, right? So it's not the answer. The world doesn't need more hustlers and grinders and whatever. Like what the world needs is healing, and the ability for humans to activate the inner healing within other humans. Unfortunately, we don't see that. We see manipulation on a mass scale now, where whole populations, like for example, the United States, like I am, my jaw drops every time I see what their media is doing to them, what their government is doing to them, what their news is doing to them. This is like targeted, calculated, deliberate um, brainwashing. It's I've never seen anything like it. Like, and it's such a on a mass scale. At some point, maybe about like 10 or 15 years, for the past 10 or 15 years, they have gone full scope with it. So in the past, if it was just like indoctrination, let's say in schools and academia, now, and this is why I say that America is a fallen country. If you understand psychology, if you look at it, you understand that America is a fallen country because what they are subjected to, like the whole populace of the nation, what they're subjected to is an incredible barrage of um, uh, trauma projection, right? Through media, through I don't know everything, right? Um, every piece of entertainment you see somehow revels in the idea of this fantastical la la land that we talked about, right? And it revels the idea of taking charge. You're an individual. You can be whatever you want. Da 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 da. Mm, And then it actually gives you the legislative tools to achieve that. That's why it's scary, right? So if I'm your parent and if you come to me and you tell me, hey dad, I saw, my teacher today told me that I could be like, whatever gender I want, and I decided to be a boy now. I don't want to be a girl anymore. I just want to be a boy now. And if I tell you, no, like, that's impossible, my dear. You can't be a boy. You're a girl. You were born a girl, right? If my daughter can go and call whatever they call like social services on me, right? Like they literally have the legislative tools to both fortify and support their disillusionment, right? And that's a terrifying thing. That's a terrifying thing. And over time, it's going to have this crazy ripple effect. Um, it's already having this ripple effect. You see, like all of these school shootings and just people when you talk to people from the US in particular, because this is where like the brainwashing is strongest, they can't communicate with you on a human level, right? They've become so polarized. So it's either like, hey, are you for the Reds or the Blues? Are you for the Blues or the Reds? Right? Like that's they have them sort of like dangling on either side of the rope, right? And everyone has this incredible survivalist attitude, and that's like one half of the nation, and the other half of the nation is the people who are traumatized as well, but they're okay with exploiting their fellow man, so to speak, right? So it's a tragedy. It's a large scale tragedy that's going to have innumerable victims, most of which will be unnamed, most of which most people will look at and think, oh, like these deaths, these self-killing, so on and so forth, they're not connected, but they are all connected. They're all very intimately connected. Um, to understand techniques for manipulation, right? Like how you would do it on an individual level and how you would do it on a mass level. They've been perfected at this point, right? If you look at mass media, for example, right? The technique is this: everything is going to be a lie. So, like, everything I tell you is going to be a lie. This is a very, very strong manipulative technique, right? Um, so even the things that I tell you that are not going to be lies, you're going to register them as lies, as potential lies, right? So you can't trust anything the universe throws at you. Like anything society throws at you, you can't trust it. It's impossible to trust it. That does things to your psyche, man. That does really, really terrible things to your psyche. In the case, let's say, if all of your family members lie to you, like imagine if both of your parents raised you, but all they did was lie to you, right? Like, hey mom, where's I don't know, like the food, and she tell you, oh, it's over there, but it's actually not there, it's somewhere else, right? It's this sort of like backwards thing where both of these political parties who are engaged in the United States right now, this is exactly what they're doing. And people don't realize that's what they're doing. That's what they're doing. Both of them are lying to you to create that window of trauma through which manipulative techniques can later enter, right? If everyone is lying and if no one is reliable and no one is dependable, what are you going to do as a traumatized mind? Just tell me. You're going to seek out you're going to seek out some sort of third party that you will either want it to be reliable and trustworthy, or you will either, um, how to say, even if they're not, pretend like they are. This is what we're seeing with Trump and those people. Right? Like so many people want to believe. So many Americans want to believe, even to this day, right? When for me, who's outside of America, like I have no bets in that fight, right? The political arena. I don't care about who wins and blah blah. It's so apparent, but for them, it's not. Like they want it so bad for, like, for example, for Trump to be like, oh, he's playing 4D chess and he's doing this and this and that because there's nothing else to latch onto, right? Remember what we talked about trauma and it being an involuntary response and a subconscious response? Well, this is where you have it. Because if you think it's as easy as telling yourself, well, then I don't need anyone, I don't need to trust anyone, I'm just going to trust myself and my friends, right? That's not going to happen because the trauma already exists within you. And I'll tell you exactly what that trauma is. That trauma is this: society has taught you that whenever something bad happens, whenever you're in trouble, you can just call, Mr. Government, and Mr. Government is going to mediate and help you. But in truth, Mr. Government is now basically showing you, like, head first, I don't care about you. I don't care about your troubles. I'm actually not going to help you. There are people who have money who can get away with whatever they want. There are people who have the influence and power to get away with whatever they want. That terrifies people because in schools they've been indoctrinated to think in these terms. To like, if something goes wrong, I can just call the police, right? If I see something that's not lawful or not within the bounds of the law, I can just call the authorities and it'll be handled. But now they actually have to take this trauma that they have with them and come face to face with the reality that this is not how things work, and this is not how things have ever worked. And that scares them. It terrifies them. So most people, like, it's just one big fear harvest. Like, I would argue that most people in America, Canada, countries like that, they live in a constant fear, and they don't even realize like why they're constantly afraid. But that's why they're constantly afraid, because they were taught in school that like if you sit down and if you listen and if you complain to the authorities, things are gonna you know be taken care of. Like the people who are in the government, they're there to serve your interests, but now they're waking up to this new reality, which us, for example, in my part of the world, we've always known this. We've always known that, like, oh my god, like, what's social services, bro? You're on your own. You're completely on your own. If you don't have enough to survive, you're starving, and that's it. So right now, you're seeing this incredibly like long, lengthy, delayed effect of people coming to terms with this and realizing that their their parents never loved them. Their parents, in the sense of like the government, right? Like your parents never loved you. They don't actually give a fuck about you. They don't care about you, and that's traumatic. That's traumatic. And how the manipulation constantly happens is that there will always be a new force, right? Some new force will appear and they'll promise you, oh, but I know that these people don't love you, but here I am. I'm going to love you. I'm going to give you everything you need, right? I'm going to go and take care of your wishes and desires. And you, again, as you've been programmed in school for years and years and years on end, you're waiting for the lawful um, solution. You're waiting for this intervention that never comes, right? You think like, well, not everyone can't be this, but everyone is corrupt, right? For the most part. um and this is what Hollywood and all of these incredibly wealthy entertainment industry mavens and these you know very very strong psychologists, right? um and mentalists, they've been working towards. That this is the effect they've been working towards, where the whole population right now is just a bunch of traumatized children in adult bodies. And that's what you have. Like you have the identity crisis, you have the racial crisis, you have the mental health crisis. Um, you have all of these things going on at once, and it's just like overwhelming you, right? Again, like you want to fragment the mind through trauma. And when you're fragmented, when you're giving up hope, right? When you're like, fuck, man, like nothing's working, no one's like decent, like, and then you go into nihilism and hopelessness, right? Then you can just sit by while the world destroys itself, and that's what they want, right? Like your passivity is what they're after, so to speak. It's very heartbreaking for me to see it. And I imagine not a lot of people see it this way because not a lot of people are trained to think like mentalists, like psychologists, right? But it's on, and it's also such on a such grand scale. It's on such a grand level that people find it difficult to believe that it affects them. Like, it really, really, really affects them. Like all of the comic books and all of the cartoons and all of the stories and so on and so forth. They were just the building blocks for this eventual trauma to occur. And the first building block of that, like we said, is when Alice goes into Wonderland, when she's disillusioned from the real world, right? She's completely alone in within her own subconscious or unconscious or whatever we want to call it, and then the presentation of the archetype that gives her the solution, right? So it can be any sort of like imaginary friend or imaginary ideal or ideology. And then this is how they form these things through comic books and stuff like that as well in the US. Like they'll present a maddening evil villain, right? And then they'll create this archetype of a hero who comes to save the world from this villain, right? Because they have the know-how, they're capable of doing so. You're not capable of doing so. You're just a random person observing the battles going on in New York City or something, but they're able to. And then let's say this hero is Superman, so they've created this idea that somewhere, you know, in some strange hidden portion of the earth, there lives this sort of like all capable character, Superman, who's gonna come down from the sky and save you from your problems. And then what they do is they'll manufacture this sort of character on a political level, right? So they've already sort of like given you that trauma, you're disillusioned from the world and you need a savior. And then who's the savior? Well, look what Trump's page has been posting all over his page. Trump Superman, Super Trump. They're like literally just not, they're just making fun of it at this point, right? Because they can see that their programming is working. When everything is going to shit, oh, Superman is gonna arrive and he's gonna save the world. And to me, it looks so infantile. To me, it looks so childish. To me, it looks like, like wishful thinking. It not even wishful thinking. It's just like to an embarrassing degree. It's like a departure from reality, right? But um, the American public doesn't think that, right? The American public thinks absolutely, the opposite, where, yeah, this is it. This is our Superman. He's coming. He's going to save us and blah, 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 blah. The child must never be allowed to grow up. That's the idea of manipulation through trauma, right? So if the dynamic never changes with your parent figure, you know, that's exactly what's going to happen. All of these little cults in these spiritual groups, these little communities in the esoteric space, even here on X, right? People who are, very fanatical, people who are radicalized, you know, beyond repair, they suffer that same trauma, just like on a smaller scale, right? And if you ask them, that they'll deny it. Like they won't even be aware of it. Like if you ask them, like they're gonna be like, "Oh, like you're talking so much crap, and you don't know what you're talking about." Da, da, da. But it's true, right? They're gonna be the victims of that trauma because they're so emotionally attached to their idea of like what they need to be true for their current identity to survive. And it's sad. Mm, if you want to treat your own trauma, right? If you want to address your own trauma, then you have to understand that it's probably something that's beyond your ability to identify. And that's really scary, right? Like people who think they don't have trauma, like it puts the thought, you put this thought in their head that you probably do have trauma, but you're just unable to identify it. So we want to be careful with that too. But it's good to self explore to that degree, like to understand that, you know what, like maybe I do have trauma and I'm unaware of how it's affecting my life. Because you probably do, especially if you have been through like difficult moments in your life, you probably do. And like accepting that and sort of like being able to confess to yourself that that could be a really reality, right? It opens up the door to healing. Um, But if you're like adamant, they're like, no, 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 I don't have any trauma. They're like, it's the first symptom of trauma, right? Like it's like the person who says like they have no ego, usually they have like the biggest egos, right? Because someone only with like a massive ego would be able to say that they don't have any ego. It's the same sort of like traumatic relationship. So when we're working with trauma, we're working to unfold like a whole piece of us that isn't present in our conscious mind state, and that's fucking terrifying, you know, on a personal level. Like if you want to do that on a personal level, like First you have to understand facing that is not going to be simple, and it's not going to be a pleasurable experience, most likely, but it's going to be a healthy experience, right? That's what we want to do. We don't want to disillusion ourselves. We don't want to lie to ourselves. We want to come to terms with reality as is, as it is. Um, if you want to hunt down what parts of you are probably traumatized, I can guarantee you it's always the part of you that mm, it tries to convince you of something being either true or not true, um, like incessantly, obsessively, right? Um, like I'll give you an example. Like, if you get into a fight on the street and you get beat up, right? Like, what's the first place? Like, where does your mind go, right? Usually it goes, especially if you're a man or like a young man, you have a lot of pride and self dignity or honor. The first place your mind goes is like, I didn't get beat up. Like, I got him too, like one or two times, and you start to shift the story, and that's how trauma is formed, right? Like you shift the story, and then you give it 3 or 4 months, and then you never even lost the fight. You won the fight in your mind, right? This is how trauma is created, um, and it's not a fucking joking matter either, because um, a lot of people suffer from this. They will disillusion themselves to the point where constantly lying to yourself about the things that happen to you turns into a chronic behavior, a compulsive and chronic behavior. And when you have that, it's really difficult to pull yourself out of it, because once you've crossed that road where you've told yourself, I'm okay with lying to myself about what reality is in order to maintain my ego and my sense of self, um, then it becomes limitless about the things that you can lie to yourself about, right? This is why when we say like, oh, like you're full of shit, you're so full of shit, because you can do that, you can achieve that. Women like who are traumatized do this all the time. That's why like women who suffer, violence from their partners and so on and so forth, like they would rather lie to themselves about the nature of the reality they're experiencing, right? Rather than face it head on, because they get a feeling of hopelessness. If I face it head on, then I am physically inferior. Therefore, I cannot make any sort of positive change or progress towards my survival. So, if I want to survive, I'm going to convince myself that these bad things are not happening to me, right? Mm, it's a sad picture, right? It's a very sad picture. Again, like you should want to be honest with yourself, and you should want to address and heal your own trauma, because it opens you up to manipulation when you don't, and you don't even realize how, right? uh Partially like how you talk, what sort of like vocabulary you use, what profile picture you have, how you relate to other people, right? Like what your current interests are. Some parts of this could be derived from your trauma, right? When you think you've like sort of like made a conscious choice, oh, I made a conscious choice, I'm gonna go and you know do this and do that. Um, Most of it you'll find is appearances when you really dig deep into yourself, and you're trying to sort of like upkeep this appearance for like other people, through which your trauma can be treated somehow, right? Um, And that's fucked up. That's why it's called shadow work, because it's so difficult to work through it, especially alone without help, right? But you can do it. You absolutely can do it, but you need to be very candid with yourself and others, and like listen to like advice and suggestions for the people who love you as well, because you're always going to be blind to your own bullshit. That's why it's bullshit, right? Because you don't want to admit to yourself that it is. Mm, And once you sort of like begin sort of like taking off those layers, then it becomes easier and easier and easier. Like you have to understand that you're not identifying with this trauma bond identity that you formed for the outside world, but that you can actually be sort of like how you authentically and naturally are. And I think you'll also find that naturally and authentically how you are is a completely different person. It's probably someone who talks differently. It's probably someone who dresses very differently. It's probably someone who relates to other people differently, who treats people in a much more different way than you do. Especially if you struggle with maintaining a sort of like diplomacy and niceties and just generosity and stuff like that and how you communicate, because you will find like at the depth of that trauma you will find that you're a much nicer person than you think you are, right? It's almost always the same. So whenever you have like a positive outcome type of story when it comes to like treating trauma, it's always an upward swing in positivity and behavior. It's never like a downward spiral, almost never. it I've never seen a case where a person has gone through their own trauma and healed through their trauma and they ended up being more authentic, and that authenticity meant that they were more of a douchebag than they were before. Almost never. It's almost always an upward swing toward incredible positivity, and just being like a nicer, warmer, gentler presence. So if that doesn't show you that, um, the heart of humankind is kind and generous, then I don't know what will, right? But you have to learn to like take those layers off. Um, this mechanism behind uh, um, trauma and then manipulation through trauma, um, is at work 24/7 whenever you're on social media, whenever you're, you know, talking to someone who dislikes you or who's a narcissist or who, doesn't want good things for you. Right. And you'll even attract people, like when you have trauma, you'll attract people, these manipulative people who are going to try to take advantage of it and exploit that. Right. And the moment you heal the trauma, it's like it'll become so easy to like just notice these people who are not really your friends, right? It'll become so much simpler. Like it's like, how did I fall for this before, right? Like that's sort of like the effect it has on you. Um, um, Overcoming it doesn't mean that its symptoms are gonna go away. Overcoming it doesn't mean that the full brunt of its damages are gonna fade out. It also doesn't mean like just because you can rationalize your trauma doesn't mean it's gone, right? Um, First you have to accept it. Like you have to understand that okay, like this is my blind spot, and I accept it, and I accept the fact that I can't just will myself through it. Like I accept the fact that I can't, Nike just do it. I can't. Like it's impossible. If I were able to do it, I would have done it a long time ago. That's the first step, right? The second step is understanding that the people who tell you to just do it, they're fucking full of shit. They're bullshitting. They either don't know or they're trying to make themselves, they're trying to prop themselves up like into something than more than they really are, right? Because they also have things that they're dysfunctional at, guarantee, that they're trying to hide from the world, right? So those two things, and step three, and the most difficult step, I guess, out of the three, is calling yourself out on your own bullshit, right? Understanding, okay, this is my trauma. This is what I suffer from. Like, for example, um, I'll give you guys another example of um, um, this person that thinks they don't have trauma, but they actually have deep set trauma, right? So uh, they're a uh, nice lady, 32 years old, I believe. Um, um, and all like throughout the year, 364 days, she's nice and kind and cordial or whatever, except for on her birthday, right? Like, on her birthday, she has like this weird obsession that everything needs to be done the way she wants it to be done. So everyone has to give her the gifts she wants to be, getting. Everyone needs to come at a time where she's comfortable with it for her party. Just incredibly obsessive, right? Um, and usually people will say, well, like this isn't like, well, okay, she's just like quirky like that, but she's not quirky. She is heavily traumatized, right? But she doesn't realize it. Like she just like takes it. Oh, it's just like a part of who I am. I am. It's part of my nature. What's part of your nature? Being an obnoxious, terrible person is a part of your nature. That's ridiculous. No such thing can be a part of anyone's nature, right? So that's sort of like a trauma thing. So she has an issue with control. Well, why does she have an issue with control? Well, most likely because her parents were incredibly controlling of her, right? And then, sort of like as rebellion against that, now she's become incredibly controlling of her surroundings because her parents taught her that if something is out of your control, then it's dangerous, it's threatening, and it makes her feel terrible. It makes her feel bad if something is out of control. In relationships, she becomes obsessive. In relationships, she becomes volatile when she doesn't get her way. She becomes incredibly jealous. Da, 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 da. So all of these things are constructed on top of that. So yes, when someone comes to me and I tell them, "Well, you're probably traumatized, and this is why you joined this cult," right? And they'll laugh about it. I'm like, "There's nothing to laugh about, my friend. You know, I can see right through your trauma. You probably had a terrible relationship with your father." And they'll tell me, "Hey, how did you know that?" Right? Or they'll lie and they'll say, "Well, no, I had a great relationship with my father." Well, then why do you carry the symptoms of someone who had a terrible relationship with their father? Right? So coming to terms with that is really painful, right? You don't have to do it with other people, but at least do it on your own, like with yourself. And again, you can't save everyone, right? Um, these people, like some of them are just too far gone. You can't save them, and be careful too, right? Know what your traumas are, know what your darkness is, so people can't use it against you, right? Accept them, like live with them, um, and reward yourself at your own pace, right? Don't ever allow these fake, idiot internet personalities who are faking their wealth and their well-being and their health and everything to convince you that you're like somehow not doing enough or you're somehow like lagging behind, right? There's no such thing as lagging behind. Like we're not all blank slates. We're all very different humans with very different roles. Even if you know basic physiognomy, you know that every different person has a different role in society. We have different fates and destinies, right? So the person who's traumatized and wants to manipulate you will always will try to bring you into their arena where they know they can win, right? They'll bring you into their arena and then they'll belittle you and make you feel incompetent, right? So it's just some food for thought. That's how trauma and manipulation sort of like interweave and how they work together. Um, you probably have more than you think you do, but you're probably more capable at um, sort of like fixing those than you think you are as well. So there's sort of like that thing. Um, if you come to me and you'll tell me, Uncle Jack, no one can manipulate me, no one can lie to me. I already know that several people are already manipulating you and they're already lying to you constantly. Okay. If you come to me and you say, I don't have any ego, I've experienced ego death, I already know that you have an ego problem, right? If you come to me and you say, well, these terrible things happened to me, but I healed from all my trauma and I overcome them, and I already know you're still very traumatized, right? So all of these outward excuses and outward proof that you want to prove to me, right? As someone who's been in this field for a very long time, right? I know the function of that. I know the function behind like why you keep saying that, right? So look at yourself and like what are you convinced about yourself that you know you've overcome? Are you convinced that you have no trauma? You probably have some trauma. Are you convinced that you can never ever be manipulated by anyone? You're probably being manipulated right now. Um, that's why it's shadow work. That's so it's difficult because you really have to call yourself out on your own bullshit, right? Um, and even me, right? Like I'll never um, sit here and like tell you, for example, that like I have it all figured out and blah 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 blah. But just being really real with yourself and understanding what your blind spots and your weaknesses are, it makes you a little bit more aware of how someone would try to manipulate you through what types of vulnerabilities they would try to get to you, right? If you know what those vulnerabilities are. But if you convince yourself that you're unapproachable and you're untouchable and you're just like you're immune to all of these things, you're probably just eating up so much garbage, right? You're eating up so much bullshit. Um, yeah, but all of these things that go back to the cartoons you were raised on, comic books you were raised on, songs you were raised on as well. And I just look through them and like understand like, okay, like what is the idea that's been seeded into my subconscious, into my psyche? What, what is the seed um, that they're waiting for it to sprout, right, within my psyche? Because those are not nice things, right? Those are not nice things, right? For children, they're very traumatic, and adults, like, you know, you're just you're still the same child. It's just like you've had a little bit more time, right? Um, so yeah, think on that. Wanted to talk about trauma. Wanted to you to understand that you can't save everyone from it. Some people just are addicted to their manipulators too much. Try not to fall into it. And again, like avoid, you know, these radical ideologies, cults, memberships in like these weird communities or whatever. Especially if they offer you like companionship and all that bull crap, you don't need any of that crap in your life, and most likely it's a manipulation technique. And they're just probing you for personal info or some sort of vulnerability, right? Um, all the real ones are going to preach personal empowerment and, following or learning from someone through choice. They're never going to preach about how great of a person someone is and why you should listen to them, or what a great community they have and why you should be a part of it, why you need healing and you need to go to this person to find your inner peace. They're never going to have those narrative points. Never, ever, ever. Like all of the real ones, what they're going to tell you is like you have what it takes to overcome your trauma. You don't have to compare yourself to others, and you should seek personal empowerment and the empowerment of the people you love and humanity in general. And if you wish to learn, you can humbly learn, from me for this period of time, and that's it. Right? Um, eh, like they will never force you to belittle yourself um, in order to gain something from them, right? Especially if you have a wound, you have a mother wound, you have a father wound. First, find it, then confess to yourself that you have it, so you're protected from having that used against you, right? So yeah, booyah. Think about that, folks. Yeah, thanks for joining in. We're gonna do um, we're gonna do the next one on mysticism, I think. Christian mysticism or something along those lines. But I want to go into more practical things like psychology, because I think like um, this space, this esoteric space, is a bunch of crazy woo woos. It's a lot of crazy people um, that have no base foundation in like actual, like they're far removed from reality. So I want to talk about like basic things again. Like I want to talk about trauma. I want to talk about like trauma bonding, like manipulation. I want to talk about um, the practical elements, the practical spiritual elements, right? That people are like removed from. Like you need to understand these things and why they're important, because they permeate your daily lives, right? So yeah, much love to you all. Peace, and yeah, have a good one. See ya.